Hello, I'm Minas Georgios, and this is my practice-led research. The research question is an attempt to create a new sound/genre by combining elements from existing genres. The purpose of this research is to conduct an experimentation process of combining elements from different genres in order to create a new sound. It's aiming to provide insights of the process which will possibly benefit music artists, composers, music producers, and their creative endeavors. In other words, it aims to prompt the above-mentioned creatives to cut experiments outside of the comfort zone in order to discover new sounds and maybe create new genres, original pieces, and will possibly lead the music industry to a different direction. Here it's important to mention that the main argument of this paper is not whether how successful the attempt has been or not, whether the compositional pieces consist new genres or not, whether the focus should go on the process itself, and data extracted from such a research can be a very resourceful tool for creatives in the field of music, reinforcing their creativity, to discover new sounds, genres, and cut experiments outside of the comfort zone. The methodology of this paper. This paper employs the methodology of practice-led research. And what is it, practice-led research? So, scholars have given many definitions. Hazel-Smith and Roger Dean define practice-led research as creative work within the academic environment, whether Graham Sullivan defines practice-led research by saying that this type of research implements methodologies which move from unknown to known rather than traditional research methodologies, which is vice versa. And he also emphasized on the process of data creation rather than data collection. Creativity. Creativity is involved in every creative art, such as music. It's important to be mentioned here. Paula Thompson and Victoria S. Chuck, and they define creativity as something that requires novelty and usefulness, features that describe a creative product. Authenticity, aesthetic appeal are now added to the two criterion definition. Okay. Also, Peter Campbell in his book Persistent Creativity states that many of the elements that come to characterize the discourse of creativity in the 20th century can be seen to be espoused much earlier. For instance, the idea that creative practice can be at the core of wider industrial outputs, or that culture can be beneficial in immediate ways. So, once we talked about creativity, and let's go and have a look and have a talk about music genres. In regards to genres, we have two schools of thought. There are scholars that argue that genres still exist, while others support that we live in a genre-fluid age and genres continually diffuse and disappear. So, Jeff Legels and John Levels, in their study Music Classification, Genres and Change Patterns, they consider music genres to be solid and defined concepts, whereas barriers constantly evolve and expand. So, through their findings, they organized the findings in six groups: the one of classical vicarious, contemporary international pop, classical and classic pop, classical and contemporary pop, pop and rock across generations, local and influential pop. Why I mention this? The fact that these scholars create these groups of different types of music reveals that they are supporters of the genre still exist. Also, Daniel Silver, Monica Lee, and Clayton Childress, in their study Genre Complexes in Popular Music, they refer to sociological literature attempting to justify why genres should persist in structuring musical production and consumptions. And they give reasons why producers rely on these categories. Musicians rely on these categories in order to achieve collaborations, to advertise themselves, and genres also work as incentives in connecting with audiences. So in this study, the authors separate genres in three worlds, including rock, hip hop, and niche genres, and they support that all the other genres are sub-genres of these three ones. David Taff, in his survey and analysis of common songwriting and production practice 2014-2015, he investigates Billboard songs and he distributes these songs among 5 different groups, which is country, hip-hop, pop, rock and R&B. Another scholar which seems to be supporting the idea of that genre still exists. Keith Negus, in his book Music Genres and Corporate Cultures, mentions that consumer intelligence has been integral to the gradual fragmentation of markets and the separation of working practices into various subunits defined by genre. Another opinion. Now let's take a look on the opposite side, the genre fluid age. Daniel Silver, Monica Lee and Clayton Childress, again. Now they approach the idea from a different perspective in contrast to the previous one. They give 3 reasons why genres diffuse and disappear. First one is social networks like Facebook may increase the salience of network ties in music diffusion while decreasing the salience of genre labels and other traditional forms of classification. Also, music streaming services like Spotify reinforce the idea of genre diffusion. We can find many playlists with different genres mixed in. And also music festivals and venues, we decline the idea of genre classification by organizing many events with artists from all different genres, reinforcing the idea that we live in genre fluid age. Also, Shirley Fedorak argues that popular music has an impact on the diffusion of musical genres, and she brings the example of the Christmas carols, which are now considered popular instead of religious music. For this research, I acknowledge that barriers among genres continually disappear and tend to fuse. However, they're still present. The guidelines that define them still exist. So, research and practice. Before we dive into the process, I'd like to explain that there are 3 different sounds genres which I'm trying to create. First one is dark pop, the second one is psytone, psychedelic reggaeton, the third one is a rock house. I would like also to say that a lot of combinational knowledge has been implemented, combining elements, as the title suggests, combining elements from all different genres in order to reinvent the sound and create a new genre. And once more to mention, it's not how successful the creation of genre has been, rather than the process itself. So, let's dive in the process. Let's have a listen to the first one, the dark pop.
You shouldn't be so good. You shouldn't be so sad. No, you say I'm young and I'm bold, but that could not be so bad. Yeah, I like to walk in the sand with some drinks in my hands for sure. You're good for nothing, I don't know, so I don't know what you're here for. You say I'm badass, you don't know me at all. Why give you my number, don't want you to call. Yes, I am bad, but I know from the past that you and me are not going to last. Da-da-dum, dum-da-dum. Da-da-dum, dum-dum. Da-da-dum, dum-da-dum. Da-da-dum, dum-na-na-na. Da-da-dum, dum-da-dum. Da-da-dum, dum-dum. Da-da-dum, dum-da-dum.
This is a conflict of interest, and for sure you're not ready for my bitterness.
No, I don't trust in my guts, but I can take care of myself. You make me feel like I'm nuts, but I'm just like nobody else.
Okay, that was part of the song. Wait, let's dive into the process and explain. As the English, Dr. Ian English suggests that performance of much contemporary music is mediaized and reaching audiences through sophisticated audiovisual technologies. It's a fact, and most composers and producers we use now we implement technologies in order to produce our work. So for this process I used Logic and Cubase later on to mix the project. So creating the dark pop piece. Before I started creating, I analyzed examples of mainstream pop artists including Ariana Grande, Lana Del Rey, Lady Gaga, Billie Eilish, regarding the song arrangement, the sounds of the percussion ensembles, and the drum patterns played in the recordings. Once comprehended, the next step was to create a typical arrangement such as intro, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, post-chorus, verse, pre-chorus, chorus, and outro, which is quite common among pop recordings. Next step of the process was to create the main melody. I wanted to create a melody which inspires an ominous, spooky feeling. Dun, 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 dun. And the melody we can hear in the recording. And in order to meet the target of dark pop, create a mainstream pop recording which is dark in a sense and not so bright like the ones we tend to listen on the radio. I achieved that desired sound from my melody by using the Fat Moog synthesizer in Studio 4, and I adjusted parameters including modulation, oscillators, filter cutoff, and envelope generators in order to create exactly the sound I wanted. The rest of the musical elements are weaved together in relation to the synth melody, resulting in that piece we heard. It's also important to mention that the use of analog bass guitar in order to reinforce the idea of warmness, and analog sound shapes the higher frequencies, tames the higher frequencies, so it gives an idea of more warm sound in a sense, and that reinforces the whole idea of the gloomy sounding piece. And regarding lyrics and vocal performance, Rita Katrupa was there in the studio. She wrote the lyrics during the session, and we recorded her vocals once we had the production ready. Next one is the psychedelic reggaeton piece. Let's have a listen.
I stay awake until the first glimmer of sun hits the horizon. I am afraid of the dark. No one to talk to, only my own thoughts to live with. My mind going to dark places. Life is passing by, don't know what else to say. Look outside and cry, wish we could get away. You're staying in my mind, don't know what else to do. Waiting for the sunrise, hope we could just get through. Wish it was a nightmare, so I could wake up. I'm praying every night for temporary woke-up. Singing at the window, drive myself insane. I'm done with all the suffer, don't want no more this pain.
Okay, we get the idea. We don't have to listen to the whole recording because we're running out of time. Right. My personal research on reggaeton music has allowed me to identify the most basic elements, which is the drum pattern. And as you can see, I'm approaching the first two and the third one, as you'll find out, of the pieces from the perspective of the drums pattern. Because through my research, I've figured out that drums is one of the main things, the drum pattern that defines what the genre is. So I approached all three recordings from the perspective of the drums, and the drum pattern, as you can see in the picture above, the rhythm of reggaeton music, it's usually one that the human body easily adapts on it, and it's supposed to be danced. So in order to create that piece, I used Cubase. I collected many patterns, drum patterns and sounds labeled as reggaeton from the online platform Splice. Once I had all the material, I created a structure which is drawing more from psychedelic rock arrangements in order to reinforce the idea of psychedelia in reggaeton music, which is something that doesn't really exist. And next step was to elaborate music samples belonging to psychedelic trance music, once more to reinforce the idea of psychedelia. And finally, time-based effects with reverb and delay in order to create space and depth for the recording. Depth. Right, next one is the rock house. Let's have a listen. I will have to stop this here because I'm a little bit cautious of time. So, again, personal experience, I was able to identify common characteristics of house music, which is the tempo, usually around 125, 4/4 signature most of the time, actually always, and specific sound in drum patterns, samples, sorry, and predefined drum patterns of alternating, as we can see in the picture, kick, snare, king, snare. If I imitate the sound with my mouth, it would be something like boop, psh, boop, psh, boop, psh, with hi-hats all the way, usually four or more hi-hats in every bar. So the whole idea came by listening house recordings and contemplating how a house production would sound with rock guitars on it, and that ignited the whole idea. And yeah, I've started the process by gathering samples which belong to the house family. I imported all the samples in Logic Pro, and then as we can see in the video, I've started creating the typical arrangement for it. And the last step of the process was to add a distorted guitar lead on top of the melody, which is something that distorted guitars are usually found in rock music, so adding them in a house production could result in a rock house piece. And to conclude, because we're done, yeah, the purpose of this paper was to create new music genre, not to create new music genres necessarily, but to show that boundaries among genres deplete and disappear. We're living in a genre fluid age. While genres still exist, but we're heading towards there. And I'll through my research, my focus is to prompt and push artists, music producers to experiment more and create more unique sounds. The focus is not whether these pieces are new genres or not, whether the combination of knowledge and the insights that can be extracted from such a process can benefit creatives and music producers. Thank you very much.